When I bought my Nintendo Switch around 3 years ago, it reintroduced me to franchises I loved when I was a kid with games such as Mario Odyssey, Kirby Star Allies, and Pokemon Sword and Shield. But aside from the franchise that I already had experience in, the Switch had introduced me to games from first-party series that, for whatever reason, I've just completely ignored. A few of those franchises being Dragon Quest, Animal Crossing, Legend of Zelda, and the biggest standout for me, Fire Emblem. Now, with over 270 hours played, I'm going to explain to you how Fire Emblem Three Houses, a game completely off my radar, ended up becoming one of the greatest games I've ever experienced. Before I get into the review, I wanted to quickly talk about another game because, if I'm being honest, while Three Houses got me into the Fire Emblem games, it was actually a game called SteamWorld Heist that got me into the strategy RPG genre. Before playing Heist, I wasn't experienced or interested in any SRPGs, but the gameplay and overall charm of that game specifically really opened my eyes to what I could possibly be missing. It was something about moving your players across a map and having to think 7 moves ahead that got me hooked. The only problem for me is I'm really big on games having a good story, as well as seeing characters grow and develop over the course of that story. And while Heist is a great game, that wasn't something it really could provide for me. Around this time, Nintendo was pushing out trailers and clips for Fire Emblem Three Houses, which was set to be released in July of 2019. At first, I wasn't really paying attention to any of the promotion, but then I randomly decided to watch the trailer showcasing the Blue Lion house. Watching the characters of the Blue Lions be introduced and a lot of them having various relationships with one another, some dating all the way back to childhood, piqued my interest and made me want to learn more about this game. I started watching gameplay of Three Houses that included combat, spending time at the Monastery, as well as leveling up your character weapon skills, which led to class promotions. The more clips and trailers I watched, the more excited I became to play this game once it was finally released. Being that it was my first Fire Emblem game ever, I struggled a lot in the beginning, but once it finally clicked, I was sold.
I can't lose! It's my duty.
If you play any other Fire Emblem game, the core gameplay is the same. At the start of every chapter, you have a certain amount of characters or units to use on a current map. You move your units across a chessboard to fight the opposing unit on the map. The amount of spaces a specific unit can move depends on the current class of that unit. For instance, a bow knight or an assassin will be able to move more spaces than an armored unit or a swordsman. As your units move across the maps to fight the enemy units, their success and failure is greatly dependent on their weapons and skills. In previous Fire Emblem games, there was a weapon triangle format similar to rock, paper, scissors, where units with a specific weapon always had the advantage against units with the wrong weapon. An example being, an archer always had the advantage against a lance unit would always beat a sword unit, and a sword unit would always beat an archer. However, in Three Houses, they got rid of that gameplay element in favor of giving the player more freedom and customization with combat arts. Combat arts are various abilities your unit will learn as they level up in their individual classes. An axe wielder might have a little trouble defeating a lance user, but if it has the combat art called Lance Breaker, that ability will give that unit a slight edge in the interaction. The trade-off, however, is anytime you use a combat art with a weapon, that weapon loses durability. That Lancebreaker move helped you kill an enemy in front of you, but now you lost 3 uses in durability with that axe. Most weapons give you around 20 to 25 durability uses, and once you run out, that weapon breaks and you have to use or purchase a new one. The high risk, high reward element with combat arts adds a lot more strategy and, in my personal opinion, more fun to the overall game. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, deciding factor involving gameplay are the classes you put your units in. Earlier, I mentioned that classes determine how many steps a character can make per turn, but there's more to it than just that. Classes are typically divided into physical attackers such as archers, brawlers, lancers, and axe wielders, or magic users such as mages and healers. As your units fight and complete chapter missions, they'll level up and be able to graduate into new and stronger classes. If you're someone who worries about having efficient builds for characters, like myself when I was playing Divinity Original Sin 2, thankfully Three Houses gets rid of any issues you might have. In previous Fire Emblem games, the units for the most part had predetermined paths as far as what classes they could be best suited for. A sword unit couldn't become a mage, and if they could, they would be terrible at it and also be a hindrance to your team. In Three Houses, any of your characters can be promoted or graduate into whatever class you want as long as you meet the necessary requirements. The units have letter grades and arrow indicators to let you know what skills they excel in or what skills they may have trouble in. For example, a unit will start off with a C in brawling and blue arrows while having an E in healing with red arrows. Blue arrows mean it will be easier for this unit to excel at this skill, and a red arrow means it will be quite difficult for that unit to grow in that area. Even though it will take longer, units can still excel in the category that they're not good at. Having the ability to essentially make any unit efficient in any class your heart desires is really freeing, and that level of customization really adds a lot to the replayability in an already lengthy game. What separates Fire Emblem from most strategy RPGs is its classic mode, which includes their trademark feature known as permadeath. I'm assuming the name is pretty self-explanatory, but for those who are still confused, permadeath is a game element where if a unit's HP reaches 0 during a mission, that character is considered dead in the game and will be unable to be used for the rest of your playthrough. The severity of this game mechanic adds so much more impact to every decision you make, which also adds to the gratification of completing the chapter with none of your characters dying. Now, unlike previous Fire Emblem games, there is a newly added feature to Three Houses called Divine Pulse that lets you rewind time if you made a move that led to one of your characters being killed. Divine Pulse is useful for newcomers who still want the classic Fire Emblem experience but don't want to be punished for one or two mistakes. Also, while being useful, Divine Pulse isn't infinite, so you can't just keep spamming it, and it's also optional if you prefer the challenge of not using it at all. The added stress of keeping all of your units alive is what keeps a lot of hardcore Fire Emblem fans coming back to the franchise, but if none of that sounds fun to you, you can still play on casual mode where if a character dies, they'll return after the end of the current mission, so no worries.
Mother, I will see you soon.
When you're not completing story or side missions, the rest of your time will be spent in the school, or to be more specific, the Monastery. If you ever played Persona 5, another one of my favorite games, then you'll be familiar with this hybrid format. You get your story mission for the month and possibly some side missions to do throughout the month as well. But the main purpose of your time spent in the Monastery is to get to know all the students and teachers at the school. The reason this is important is because if there's a character you like that isn't in the house you chose, you still have the chance to recruit them if you meet the required qualifications, such as specific weaponry skills. Whatever house you choose will have enough units for you to have a balanced team to get through the campaign without significant trouble, but having some extra units as backups in case they fit your team better or one of your units die is probably a smart decision. It'll be easier to recruit a unit if you spend time with them while in school to further develop a relationship with those individual characters. Whether it's eating lunch together, putting them in a tournament, singing at the church, or just simply inviting one of them to tea. All of these things will help build the bond between you and the students. And those various activities will also help develop what's known by Fire Emblem fans as supports between other units as well. But I'll talk about that support system a little later. When I got back heavy into gaming around 2017, I became more focused on the stories being told in video games rather than just the gameplay itself. In fact, I began to care about character development and the overall narrative just as much as the gaming aspect, if not more so. Thankfully, not only does Fire Emblem Three Houses have 4 fantastic stories to choose from, it also gives you time to get to know the characters that you're leading into battle. First, I want to talk about the main story paths. To briefly describe the plot of the first half of the game before the time skip, you start out as a mercenary named Byleth, who is asked to become a teacher at a school called Garrick Mach Monastery. At the monastery, all the students are divided in the aforementioned 3 houses: the Black Eagles, the Blue Lions, and the Golden Deer. Just so you know, I chose the Blue Lion house as my first route to play through, so my opinions on story is primarily based on that singular storyline. But I played enough of the other 3 routes to have an opinion about all 4 narratives. The first half of the game is mostly the same between all of the houses, with some minor but still significant changes based on the individual lore of each house. However, in the latter half of the game, depending on the house you pick, the story is going to be dramatically different. Without spoiling too much, in the second half of the game, a war breaks out and your position and perspective on that war is based on the path you chose in the beginning of the game. The narrative isn't telling anything that hasn't already been done, but Three Houses does a fantastic job of making you understand each house's lord's perspective on the war while also having their individual philosophies challenged by Byleth as well as other characters in the game. Even though it isn't spoken about directly, another big part of the story is the fact that during the war, you're forced to fight and ultimately kill most of the students and teachers from the monastery that you didn't recruit in the first half of the game. The reason this added element is so significant is because of the relationships you develop with the characters through another Fire Emblem game feature known as support conversations, which is honestly my personal favorite part of the game.
Do you mean to imply you have no intention of acting a bit more respectably?
Please don't yell like that. Everybody's staring at us.
When you were 8, you came on to my sweet, sweet granny. My granny!
Come on. I was 8 and she was That was a long time ago.
For those who don't know, supports are bonds that lead to conversational skits between characters in the game. These conversations only happen if the bond and or relationship between those characters grow, whether through combat by them fighting alongside each other or through various events during your time in the monastery, such as sharing a meal, returning items, giving gifts, or having tea together. The reason these supports are my favorite part of the game is because they add depth and backstory to what would otherwise be pretty silent characters. A perfect example would be the support between Byleth and one of my favorite characters in Three Houses, which is Sylvain. On the surface, Sylvain comes off as a pretty boy who coasts through life on his looks and really loves to treat women as his personal playthings. And if you don't recruit him or see any of his supports, that's probably all you'll think of him as well. But during his supports with Byleth and also other characters, one of them being Mercedes, you learn that because of the crest that some people are born with like he was, most women only see him as someone to potentially have a baby with who might also bear a crest, making her and her child's life that much more luxurious. Because he believes that these girls only see him as a potential chance at a carefree life, Sylvain has grown jaded as well as resentful towards women and acts the way he does because of it. Whether or not you think Sylvain's actions are justified is just one of the interesting conversations that many of these support relationships lead to. How Ferdinand and Dorothea first met, Ingrid dealing with her prejudice towards Dedu, Caspar and Petra's strenuous relationship involving their respective fathers, Lysithea and Edelgard's shared childhood trauma, or just as something as lighthearted as Felix wanting Bernadetta to show him her flawless combat techniques, are only a few of the different storylines that are waiting for you if you take the time to get to know these students. Having all these many side stories in the game adds so many layers to these characters, which is actually what makes the permadeath component I mentioned earlier so much more impactful.
Yeah! Hurrah!
Although my overall experience with the game was incredible, there were quite a few significant things that could have been improved. One of the most common complaints I have is the lack of diversity in the maps. Especially in the non-story related battles, it was pretty much just 3 or 4 different varieties of maps. Repetitiveness is a big issue with me in this game overall actually. The animations for combat arts during the game all looked the same depending on which weapon or class the character was in. It felt like there were only 2 sword animations, 2 or 3 bow animations, maybe 2 mage animations, and so on. There were also a lot of repeat character movements during dialogue interactions, such as support or story conversations. It feels to me like a lot of these things were either worked on last or just wasn't made that much of a priority. In the next game, it would be nice to see a lot more variety in the animation department. Another issue I had was with some of the classes the units can level up into, or couldn't level up into to be more specific. This game unfortunately has a few classes that are gender specific. For example, a female unit can't be a war hero, and a male unit can't be a Pegasus Knight. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it does add to the game feeling a little bit more constrictive and stagnant. Some of the master classes leave a lot to be desired as well. Bow Knight, War Master, and Grimoire are all great, but most of the other classes in the final tier are almost a step down compared to the classes in the advanced tier. And my last issue has to do with the time spent in the monastery. In part 1 of the game, not only is there so much to do as mentioned earlier, there are also many characters to interact with such as students, teachers, animals, etc. But in part 2, after the time skip, the characters you didn't recruit have sided with other sides of the war, so they won't all be in the same place. And because of that, when you're in the monastery, the only people there are your original squad and any units you may have recruited along the way. This unfortunately leads to everything you do at the school to feel Honestly, kind of boring. There aren't as many missions to do at the school, and because there are significantly less people around, there's a lot less dialogue and interactions to enjoy. Overall, when it comes to my complaints and concerns, I feel like a little extra polish could have gotten rid of a lot of these issues, and hopefully developers will learn for the next entry into the series.
Reach for my
To wrap this whole thing up, I can honestly say that Fire Emblem Three Houses is not only one of my favorite strategy RPGs, but one of the best RPGs I've ever had the privilege of playing. It's kind of crazy how a game I bought almost on a whim made me such a huge fan of a franchise, but that's exactly what happened. Three Houses has led me to buy all of the Fire Emblem games for the 3DS, including Fire Emblem Awakening, Birthright, Shadow of Valentia, and also what I'm currently playing, which is Fire Emblem Conquest, and I would recommend all of them if you own a 3DS. I'll say that if you made an assumption about this game or franchise based on its genre, I would advise you to give Three Houses a chance because it's a great entry point into the series, and if you're anything like me, your only regret will be that you didn't start playing these amazing games sooner.
silver shines, the world dines, a smile on each face. As joy surrounds, compared to bounds, and I can feel him breaking free. For just this moment lost in time, I